Have you ever made a decision that made you think, how could I ever have thought this was a good idea? Cursing your past self for its lack of foresight. The reason we sometimes make decisions that lead to regret and disappointment lies within our psyche. There is a specific flaw in our brain that greatly contributes to poor decision making, and almost nobody is aware of it. Falling victim to this flaw is unpleasant when you go wrong with a minor decision. But when you make a poor major life decision, this bug in our mental software can quickly put you in a precarious situation. What if I told you that there's a simple technique to help you circumvent this design flaw? An effective solution that will allow you to make better decisions more often. That's what we will be discussing today, so strap in. To explain what I mean by a flaw in our brain, let's take a look at the life of Adolph Fischer, a little-known German refugee who migrated to the USA in the 19th century. Like every good story, we'll start with the end. More specifically, we'll start with the last days of Adolph Fischer's life. I want you to imagine the following scenario. You're sitting in a bar, having a good time with a few of your friends, when suddenly the police bursts in. They arrest you immediately, you don't know what's going on. You are then dragged in front of a court, they accuse you of a crime you haven't even heard of. The evidence they rely on is deliberately fabricated to incriminate you despite your innocence. You are found guilty by a biased judge and sentenced to a public execution. There's nothing you can do about it. Just like that, your life is over. Now, imagine the day of your execution. Just a few days after your arrest. You're standing on the scaffold. A big crowd is watching you. The executioner asks you for your last words. Imagining yourself in this situation, what would you say? And more importantly, how would you feel? Well, Adolph Fischer faced this exact situation. His last words were, "This is the happiest moment of my life." Now, you're probably asking yourself, how could anyone honestly say that the day of his execution was the happiest day of his life? Especially when you have been arrested on a night out, falsely accused of fabricated evidence by a biased judge, and then publicly executed. For most of us, this would probably be the least happy day of our lives. As you might imagine, there's more background information which is not immediately obvious that will help us understand his reaction. As I said before, Adolph Fischer was a German refugee who migrated to the USA in the 19th century, when he was around 15 years old. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing in America at this point. As a consequence, the economy was booming and social change was happening rapidly. During this period, there were no real labor laws. Workers were expected to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Adolph Fischer, who grew up among the working class, was not happy about this. The economic boom of this period didn't last forever though. Between the years 1882 and 1886, the economy slowed down again. This was a time when anarchist and socialist worker movements grew in size. Strikes were happening more often and became a real nuisance for the employers and factory owners. Fischer was mainly working in printing houses at the time. By this point, he also had a wife and 3 children. He wanted to fight for the cause of the working man and joined several anarchist and socialist movements. He also worked as a typesetter for a pro-worker newspaper in Chicago. In the events leading up to Fischer's death in the spring of 1886, there was a strike happening at a large factory for farming machines. The workers demanded an 8-hour workday instead of the 12-hour workday they currently had. This particular strike, however, didn't go as peacefully as planned, and 1 worker was killed. This killing of a striking worker caused several anarchists to join up and plan a response. In Chicago, there was a meeting of the local anarchists, including the owner of the Arbeiter Zeitung, the newspaper company for which Fischer was working at the time. They organized a peaceful rally the following day at Haymarket Square in Chicago. It is here that we gain a better understanding of Fischer's worldview. In preparation for the rally, Fischer had to prepare and print promotional flyers. His first version called for all workers to show up in force, suggesting that he was hoping for a demonstration of power by the working class in response to the killing the day before. This call to show up in force was too radical for the head of the newspaper, though, and had to be cut from the final version of the flyer. This correction of Fischer's radical line likely influenced his behavior later on. The rally started peacefully on May 4th. A moderate crowd gathered at Haymarket to listen to a few speakers. The weather wasn't great supposedly, and the speakers weren't taking too much time. Fischer, seemingly disappointed by the outcome of the rally, left the gathering early to spend some time in the saloon, the place of his later arrest. At the end of the rally, however, things took a dark turn. After the last speaker finished, the police began to disperse the crowd. While they attempted to end the rally, someone in the crowd threw a bomb into the policeman. With the explosion amidst the police, the protest turned bloody. The police opened fire immediately, and the chaotic mess that resulted is known as the Haymarket Massacre. A lot of people lost their lives that day. Fischer, who had left long before the rally escalated, was arrested immediately after the riot ended. The police, supposedly, found a gun and other items needed to build a bomb on him, which were likely fabricated. His participation in the meeting the night before was also seen as evidence that he knew about the bomb and was responsible for its detonation. Fischer most likely had nothing to do with the bomb. When his plan to show up in force was denied by the anarchist leaders, he probably lost interest in the rally. This is evident by him leaving early and not being present during the escalation. The anarchist leaders were very keen on keeping the rally peaceful, which failed tragically. Fischer and 3 of his colleagues were arrested and sentenced to death for the Haymarket Massacre, even though they were not responsible for its escalation. Now we are back at the end. Fischer is standing on the scaffold and is asked to say his last words. There's a minor detail I left out at the beginning of the video. His full last words were, "Hurrah for anarchy. This is the happiest moment of my life." Now it should be a bit easier to understand why he said what he said. We don't know with 100% certainty, but for him, this was most likely the greatest contribution to the workers' movement he could ever make in his life. He knew that he and the others had nothing to do with the bomb attack and were falsely accused just to create an example for others. He knew that he would die as a martyr, making a bigger contribution to the cause of the working class than he could ever make as a typesetter for a newspaper. Because of this, his own execution was actually the happiest moment of his life. It was the moment where he could make a radical change, a lasting difference for which he had worked for most of his life. The execution of Fischer and his fellow anarchists had a profound impact on the labor movement. In response, the different political groups and worker movements united their forces and stiffened their resistance, often in the name of the Haymarket Martyrs. They organized more protests and strikes to fight for a normal 8-hour workday. Over the following decades, the 8-hour workday was implemented in more and more cities and industry branches until it was realized for most working people in the US in 1937 under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So, what does Fischer's story teach us? At the beginning of the video, I told you about a flaw in our brain that can negatively influence our decision-making. The example of Fischer demonstrates this flaw perfectly. At the start of Fischer's story, I asked you to imagine his situation. We looked at the obvious circumstances, like the arrest, the false accusation, the fabricated evidence, the biased judge, and of course, the public execution. Based on this information, you most likely formed a superficial picture in your head of Fischer's situation and judged, based on that, how you would feel in his shoes. For most of you, it was probably hard to believe that anyone could have felt anything other than desperation, fear, or anger. When we looked at the details of his situation and the background, which are not immediately obvious, it became much clearer to us how Fischer could be so happy, not despite, but because of his circumstances. Fischer was upset with the oppression of the working class. He wanted to fight for his anarchist beliefs and improve the situation of the working man. In his position as a typesetter, he was unable to further this cause in the way he wanted to. With his execution, he could finally make a contribution that would matter and be remembered. The devil is in the details. This is exactly where our brain, or more specifically our imagination, is flawed. It's like the iceberg in the water. When imagining the future, we use the information that is available to us. But as we saw with Fischer, we are only able to form a superficial picture in our head. After all, we cannot possibly imagine something that we are not aware of, like all the details and complexities of a hypothetical situation. The problem is that we often assume that our superficial image is an accurate representation of how things actually are or will be. This assumption leads to mistakes. I'll give you another basic example. Let's say you decide to move to a new city because you heard that there are better career opportunities, the weather is better, the vibe is good, and so on. You imagine what it will be like to live there, only factoring in this information. In your head, life will be perfect. Once you're there, however, you notice the details you didn't imagine. The higher cost of living, perhaps, the small flat, the long commute, the distance from your family, or the lack of a social circle. If you had known this beforehand, maybe you would have decided differently. The details we can't imagine often influence our well-being the most. This is also a big problem with social media. When seeing friends or influencers on Instagram or YouTube talking about and showing off their perfect, successful lives, for example, we only see the good parts. We see images specifically designed to give us a perfect impression, a dream we think we also want. But as we discussed, most situations are much more complex. Everything has pros and cons. Perfection only exists in our imagination. We forget this fact too easily when seeing lifestyles presented on the internet, not knowing what other critical details we don't see. So, how do we solve this problem of our flawed imagination? Well, the simple answer is ask people. If you want a clearer picture of something you are considering, ask those who have experienced it. They can point out important details you might not have thought of. Their insights can help you understand how you might feel in a similar situation. One important note: the goal isn't to overanalyze every possible scenario until you know everything. That's impossible. Focus on how you feel about a decision. We often know deep down what it feels like when a decision is right. Talking to others just helps you gather key information before making a choice. Remember, not all regrettable decisions are bad. We learn valuable lessons from mistakes, and they can lead us in unexpected directions. Experiencing something firsthand is the best way to know if it's right for you, but that requires an honest reflection on how you feel in those moments. Just be careful when taking big risks, especially if you have no experience with what you are planning to start and don't know anyone who can guide you or provide important information. So, whether you want to die for anarchy or just decide on your next holiday trip, talking with people is always a good first step.